A police officer forced a black kid to bite a dead rat, unaware his father is an FBI agent. What happened next will shock you. Marcus was 14, and for a boy his age, his birthday gift was a dream come true. A sleek new bicycle, its bright paint shimmering in the sunlight, had been his father's way of showing pride in his achievements. Marcus had worked hard in school, and this bike was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of trust and encouragement. Riding through the neighborhood, dressed in a new outfit that fit just right, Marcus felt a sense of freedom. Today was about friends, laughter, and the park. The suburban streets were alive with the usual hum of life. Families chatted on their porches, kids played hopscotch on the sidewalks, and cars occasionally passed with a casual wave from the driver. Marcus pedaled with care, mindful of his surroundings. Despite his confidence, he knew he had to be extra cautious. His father often reminded him that as a black boy he was judged differently, and he carried that awareness with him even on carefree days. Turning the corner toward a quieter street, Marcus miscalculated the narrowness of the lane. His bike brushed against the side mirror of a parked police patrol car, causing it to wobble. The contact made a faint scraping sound, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The moment his feet hit the pavement, he stopped. Fear mixed with guilt, and he immediately moved to inspect the mirror. Relief washed over him when he saw the mirror wasn't broken, just a small smudge on the glass. Marcus straightened up and looked toward the car. An officer sitting in the driver's seat noticed the incident and stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his posture stiff. "It's okay, kid," Officer Randall said from a distance, his voice neutral. For a brief moment, Marcus thought the situation would end there. But as Randall approached and got a clearer view of Marcus, his demeanor shifted. His neutral tone disappeared, replaced by something sharper, more confrontational. His eyes, which had initially swept over the car, now locked onto Marcus's face and his outfit. The sight of the boy's bright clothes and expensive bike seemed to spark something in Randall that had little to do with the smudged mirror. "Hey, you stop right there!" Randall's voice rang out loud and commanding. Marcus flinched. A moment ago the officer had been calm, but now he sounded angry. The shift confused Marcus, but he obeyed, standing frozen beside his bike. Randall closed the distance, his eyes narrowing as he spoke again. "You damaged my vehicle on purpose." His words carried an edge of accusation that stung more than the boy expected. Marcus stammered, trying to explain. "I'm really sorry, sir. It wasn't on purpose. I didn't mean to." Randall cut him off mid-sentence, his tone dripping with suspicion. "You people hate the police and pull stunts like this all the time. What's your problem, huh?" The words hit Marcus like a slap. His confusion deepened. "You people." He wanted to ask what Randall meant, but hesitated, afraid of making things worse. "I swear it was an accident." Marcus tried again, his voice shaking. "I just turned the corner too fast." "Where are you from?" Randall interrupted, leaning closer. His gaze wasn't on Marcus's face, but on his bike and clothes. "You don't look like you belong here." "Nigeria, Ghana." "No, sir," Marcus replied quickly, shaking his head. "I was born and raised here. I live just a few blocks away." His answer only seemed to frustrate Randall further. "Then what are you doing in this neighborhood, riding around like you own the place? And don't tell me it's just a mistake." Marcus, his fear now turning into frustration, tried to stand his ground. "It is just a mistake. I stopped and apologized. What else do you want?" Randall's jaw clenched, his hand resting on his hip near his belt. His eyes darted to Marcus's bike again, then to the boy's clothes. "Fancy bike? Nay, nice clothes. You out here riding recklessly, and you think I'm just going to let it slide? I could arrest you for that, you know." Marcus's stomach dropped at the word arrest. His thoughts raced, trying to process how the situation had escalated so quickly. "Please, sir," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean any harm. Punish me if you want, but don't arrest me." Marcus's plea seemed to give Randall pause. The officer's expression shifted not to kindness, but to something calculative. Randall straightened, his eyes scanning the area. Up in Marcus's eyes. "Please don't make me do that. I didn't mean to hit your car. It was an accident." Randall crossed his arms, his face hard. "Your choice, voice, jail or the rat." Marcus stood frozen, his mind screaming that this couldn't be real, but the officer's unwavering gaze left no room for doubt. He had no choice. His tears spilled over as he approached the rat, every fiber of his being recoiling. His hands trembled as he picked it up, the stench making him gag. He hesitated, looking back at Randall, hoping for mercy. There was none. The officer's smirk only widened. "Do it," Randall ordered. Marcus closed his eyes and bit into the rat. The taste and texture made him gag violently, and within seconds he vomited onto the sidewalk. His body shook with sobs, and he dropped the rat, wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his shirt. Randall laughed a deep, mocking laugh that echoed down the street. "That's what happens when you mess with the police," he sneered. "A black kid eating a black rat. How fitting." Humiliated beyond words, Marcus abandoned his bike and ran. Tears blurred his vision, and he could still taste the bile in his mouth. He didn't stop until he reached his home, his chest heaving with sobs. Randall watched him go, still chuckling to himself as he returned to his patrol car. For Marcus, the joy of the day had been shattered. The bike, his new clothes, even the thought of meeting his friends, all of it felt tainted now. All he could think about was getting home, where he hoped he could find comfort and safety. When Marcus arrived home, his father, Agent Daryl Thomas, immediately sensed that something was wrong. Marcus's face was streaked with tears, his shoulders hunched, and his new clothes stained with dirt and vomit. Daryl, the seasoned FBI agent, had seen his share of distress in his line of work, but seeing his son in this state filled him with both worry and dread. He stood from his seat, his face etched with concern. "Marcus," he asked, his voice steady but urgent. "What happened to you?" Marcus froze in the doorway, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The events of the day replayed in his mind: the laughter of the officer, the taste of B, the overwhelming humiliation, and the tears began to flow again. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Seeing his son struggle, Daryl stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Take your time," Daryl said, gently guiding him to the couch. "You're safe now. Just tell me what happened." A kindness in his father's voice broke down the wall Marcus had been holding up between gasping sobs. He began to recount the events. He told his father how he had accidentally bumped into the side mirror of a police patrol car, how the officer initially dismissed it, but then turned hostile when he saw Marcus was black. He described the insults, the accusations, and finally the horrific demand to bite the rat. Daryl's expression darkened with every word, his hands clenched into fists as Marcus described how the officer had laughed while he vomited on the sidewalk. By the time Marcus finished, Daryl's jaw was set and his eyes burned with a quiet, seething rage. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him, but his voice was cold and resolute when he finally spoke. "We're not letting this go," Daryl said, pulling Marcus into a firm hug. "No one treats my son like that," and walks away from it. Marcus's trembling eased slightly in the comfort of his father's embrace, but the humiliation still lingered. "I didn't know what else to do," he mumbled. "I just wanted to get away." Daryl pulled back and looked into his son's eyes. "You did nothing wrong, Marcus, nothing. That man is the one who crossed every line, and now we're going to make sure he answers for it." Without wasting another moment, Daryl grabbed his coat and motioned for Marcus to follow. As they got into the car, Daryl's calm demeanor masked the fiery determination building inside him. His training as an FBI agent had taught him to stay level-headed under pressure, but this was personal. This was his son. The ride back to the neighborhood was tense. Marcus sat quietly in the passenger seat, his fingers gripping the edges of his jacket. He still felt the weight of the officer's laughter, the shame of what he had been forced to do. Daryl glanced at his son briefly, his anger deepening at the sight of Marcus's downcast eyes. "Point him out when you see him," Daryl said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the streets they passed. It didn't take long to spot the officer. Randall was leaning against his patrol car in a nearby parking lot, casually sipping a cup of coffee. He seemed relaxed, oblivious to the storm heading his way. Marcus's heart raced as he recognized the man. "That's him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the one." Daryl parked the car a short distance away. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice sharp but protective. Marcus nodded again, watching as his father stepped out and approached the officer. Randall looked up as Daryl neared, his brows furrowing at the unfamiliar man striding toward him. He straightened slightly, but didn't move from his spot. "Can I help you?" Randall asked, his tone dismissive. Daryl didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, grabbed the coffee cup from Randall's hand, and threw its contents onto the officer's shoe. The hot liquid splashed onto Randall's polished boots, and the pavement below causing him to yelp in pain and surprise. What the hell? Randall started, but Darrell cut him off, pulling out his FBI badge and shoving it into the officer's line of sight. "Agent Darrell Thomas." Darrell said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "And that boy you humiliated today, that's my son." The color drained from Randall's face. He stumbled back a step, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what he had just heard. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day, and realization struck him like a blow. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaky. Darrell stepped closer, his presence looming over the officer. "It doesn't matter who he is," he said, his tone low and menacing. "What you did to that child was disgusting, forcing him to bite a rat, laughing at him while he vomited. Do you have any idea how illegal that is? How inhumane?" Randall's mouth went dry. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by panic. "Look, I didn't mean." Darrell's glare silenced and "Spare me your excuses. I'm not here to listen to you gravel. You're going to admit what you did right here, right now." Randall's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he was cornered. He glanced around, found, hoping for an escape. But Darrell's unyielding stare left him with no options. The FBI agent was close enough to see the sweat beading on Randall's forehead, the tremble in his hands. Darrell reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone-pressing records. "Say it," he demanded. "Say exactly what you did to my son." Randall swallowed hard, his throat dry and his palms clammy. The once smug officer who had found such glee and humiliating Mark now looked like a trapped animal. His eyes darted from Darrell to the patrol car, as if hoping to escape, but Darrell's presence left him rooted in place. "I don't know what you want me to say," Randall stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "You know exactly what I want," Darrell said, stepping closer, his voice sharp enough to cut through Randall's feeble excuses. "I want the truth. You're going to say it loud and clear. What did you do to my son?" Randall's shoulders slumped and his hands fidgeted nervously. "It started when he hit the side mirror," he said hesitantly. I was upset, okay? I thought he was reckless. And then what?" Darrell cut in, his tone pressing, unforgiving. "Did you ask him for an apology? Did you handle the situation professionally?" "Number you didn't. Instead, you what?" "Say it." Randall winced, as though the words physically hurt him. I told him to bite the rat," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Darrell raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by Randall's half-hearted admission. "You told a child to bite a rat," he repeated slowly, his voice filled with disdain. "Why?" Randall's breathing quickened. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head, his words coming out in a panicked rush. "I wasn't thinking. I got angry. I lost my temper. I swear. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" Darrell snapped, his voice rising. "You didn't mean to humiliate him, to traumatize him, to degrade a 14-year-old boy who did nothing but accidentally brush against your car." Randall's hands trembled as he tried to explain. It was stupid, okay? I wasn't thinking straight. It's not like I planned it. Don't insult me," Darrell said, his tone icy. He leaned in closer, his glare unwavering. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You laughed while he cried. You mocked him when he begged to leave. You stood there and made a child eat a rat for your own sick amusement. So don't tell me it was an accident. Tell me the truth." Randall's face crumpled, his bravado was gone, replaced by shame and fear. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely audible. "I messed up. I shouldn't have done it." Darrell wasn't satisfied. "Say it," he ordered again. "Say what you did." Randall exhaled shakily, his voice trembling as he finally spoke the words. "I made him bite the rat," he admitted. "I made the boy bite a rat. I shouldn't have, but I did. I was angry, and I took it out on him." Darrell stood silently for a moment, letting Randall's confession hang in the air. The officer looked down at his shoes, unable to meet Darrell's gaze. The weight of his actions seemed to sink in at last, and his shoulders sagged under the burden of his guilt. Satisfied, Darrell ended the recording on his phone and slid it back into his pocket. "That's all I needed to hear," he said coldly. Randall opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. He knew there was nothing he could say to undo what he had done. Darrell turned and motioned for Marcus to step closer. The boy, who had been watching from a distance, hesitated before approaching his father's side. His eyes were still red from crying, but there was a flicker of courage in his expression as he faced the man who had humiliated him. "Let him go," Darrell said to Marcus, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "We got what we need." As they walked away, Randall stood frozen in place, his mind racing with the consequences of his actions. He watched as Darrell and Marcus got into their car and drove off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Randall's chest tightened with a mixture of regret, fear, and despair. He knew that his life was about to change forever, and not for the better. Meanwhile, Darrell drove in silence, his focus on the road, but his mind consumed with plans. He knew exactly what he was going to do next. The recording in his pocket was more than enough evidence to hold Randall accountable, and Darrell intended to use it to its fullest extent. As they approached the precinct, Marcus finally broke the silence. "What's going to happen to him?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and lingering fear. Darrell glanced at his son, his expression softening for the first time since the confrontation began. "Justice," he said simply. "That's what's going to happen." Marcus eyed his trust in his father unwavering. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of relief. The humiliation and fear he had endured wouldn't be forgotten. But he knew his father would ensure that the man who hurt him would face the consequences. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Darrell's jaw tightened once more. It was time to set the wheels of justice in motion. Darrell walked into the police precinct with an unyielding sense of purpose. The recording he carried in his pocket felt heavier with each step, not because of its weight, but because of the responsibility it represented. As an FBI agent, he had spent years upholding the law, but today he was here to confront an abuse of it. Upon reaching the chief of police's office, Darrell knocked sharply. The door opened, revealing a man in his late 50s with a grave expression. "Chief Robert Hayes." Hayes motioned Darrell inside, sensing the intent in his demeanor. Darrell wasted no time. As soon as he was seated, he pulled out his phone and pressed play. The recording filled the room with Randall's stammered confession, his humiliating orders to Marcus, and his mocking laughter. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Randall's career. As the recording ended, Darrell leaned forward, his tone calm but commanding. "That's your officer," he said, locking eyes with Hayes. "That's the man you've entrusted to represent this department. My son is 14 years old, and this is what he had to endure at the hands of someone wearing your badge." Chief Hayes's face was a storm of emotions: shock, shame, and barely suppressed anger. His hands clasped tightly on the desk as he absorbed the weight of Darrell's words. "Agent Thomas Hay," began, his voice tinged with regret, "I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what your son went through. This behavior is not only unprofessional, it's inhumane." "I'm not here for apologies," Darrell said sharply. "I'm here for accountability. That officer has no business serving in law enforcement. I want him suspended immediately pending a full investigation, and I expect that investigation to be thorough." The chief nodded solemnly. "Consider it done," he assured Darrell. Moments later, Hayes called for Randall to report to his office. While they waited, Darrell crossed his arms and stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the evening light. Marcus's face lingered in his mind, the fear in his son's eyes, the tears streaking his cheeks as he recounted the horror of biting the rat. When Randall entered the room, his expression quickly shifted from confusion to dread. He could sense the gravity of the situation before a word was spoken. His eyes darted to Darrell, who turned slowly to face him, his gaze cold and unrelenting. "Chief Hayes didn't mince words." "Officer Randall, you've been accused of gross misconduct and abuse of authority," he began, his tone hard. "We have a recording of your actions, and frankly, there's no defense for what you've done. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending a full investigation." Randall's face went pale, his mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. He glanced at Darrell, whose stoic expression offered no room for negotiation. Two officers stepped into the room, flanking Randall, to escort him out. "I'm sorry," Randall finally blurted, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean." Darrell raised a hand to silence him. "You humiliated my son. You made him bite a dead rat, a child who did nothing but accidentally brush your car. You don't get to apologize. Now save it for the investigators." Randall lowered his head, his shoulders slumping as he was led away. The weight of his actions bore down on him, and he knew that his career was effectively over. Back at home, Marcus sat on the couch, his legs tucked beneath him, as he watched. The news reports of the incident had already begun to circulate, with headlines highlighting the abuse of power by Officer Randall and the swift action taken by the FBI agent, who was also a father. When Darrell walked through the door, Marcus stood up, his face a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. What happened? Marcus asked. Daryl sat beside his son and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He suspended. And there's going to be an investigation, he said. What he did to you won't go unpunished. Marcus nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension on his face. Thank you, Dad, he said quietly. Daryl pulled his son into a hug, his resolve strengthening as he held him close. No one has the right to treat you that way, Marcus, he said firmly. You're worth so much more than that. In the days that followed, the story gained traction, sparking widespread outrage. Protests formed outside the precinct, with signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Abuse." Daryl's decision to hold Randall accountable resonated with communities across the city, shining a light on the systemic issues within law enforcement. For Marcus, the road to healing was just beginning, but with his father by his side, he felt stronger, knowing that justice was being served and that his voice mattered. As Daryl watched his son smile for the first time in days, he knew that this fight was bigger than their family. It was a fight for dignity, equality, and a future where no child would have to endure what Marcus had. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and Daryl was determined to see them through to the very end. Disclaimer: this story is purely fictional and created to address systemic injustices and prejudices experienced by many. While the events portrayed are not real, they aim to encourage meaningful conversations about fairness, accountability, and human dignity. Viewer discretion is advised.